And these are some of the things that we're going to be exploring. We're going to be exploring the idea of the connoisseur researcher. This comes from a book by Eisner.
By who?
Eisner.
Elliot Eisner.
Okay.
One of our great art educators.
We're going to talk about using mapping, external verbalization. We talked about internal verbalization last year, and graphic expression. And we're going to explore a method of the teacher researcher called the critic, also from Eisner, and using curation as a major methodology. So we'll start with the idea of the teacher as connoisseur. And as I said, Kate and Matt really wanted me to talk about critique and getting that conversation going with students. And so what I found was that one of the most important things was teacher feedback to students, but also student feedback to teachers. I turned to this one mega-analysis of practically all of the research data on student achievement. And I found that one of the most significant areas of findings within that had to do with feedback. They found that the least effective form of teacher feedback is pointing out errors in student work and performance. Now think about that. Our most common form of teacher feedback in terms of testing is all about the errors and then just leaving that. So that means that when we're using testing as our main way of giving feedback to students on how they're doing, we are using the least effective form of feedback. The most effective form of teacher feedback is demonstrating a practice or referencing content to fill in the gaps in student understanding. Now that means that the most important feedback is a response that the teacher gives to what they perceive as what the student understands. And it's already individualized then, because you're responding to either that group of students, something that you see, or you're responding to that specific student, something that you see. And that the most effective feedback is not when you say this is wrong, but when you work with them to fill in some gap in their understanding that you see. But then this was the sentence that just made me almost drop the book. I have to tell you that the man who did this is an Australian, because this is a very Australian type comment. He says, the mistake I was making, now first of all, somebody is writing this book, which was, this has been, I think, it's one of the top 5 reference books now on teaching. And he starts with the mistake I was making, like he tells us he made a mistake. I like that. The mistake I was making was seeing feedback as something teachers provided to students. And then his aside, this is the Australian part of him coming out. They typically did not, although they made claims that they did all the time. The most of the feedback they did provide was social and behavioral. But now getting back to the topic, his mistake. It was only when I discovered that feedback was most powerful when it was from the student to the teacher that I started to understand it. Now this is really important for us because student thinking is all about getting that feedback from students. And we've already got a framework that lets us think about the nature of the feedback we get. I mean, at least we can sort of see which of those categories it falls into. And then he continues to say, when teachers seek, or at least are open to feedback from students as to what students know, what they understand, where they make errors, when they have misconceptions, and when they are not engaged, then teaching and learning can be synchronized and powerful. Feedback to teachers helps make learning visible. And he found this to be one of the most important findings in student achievement. Now, the problem with this for me is that it's still mostly looking at where is the student making mistakes, what help do they need, where are their gaps. So I want to go on to talk about some of the conversation and discourse in education now about student feedback as making learning visible and the importance of learning visible. And this comes out of some of the work at Project Zero, where they're talking about making learning visible and making thinking visible. When we make thinking visible, we get not only a window into what students understand, but also how they are understanding it. And uncovering students' thinking. So part of what we're doing when we're talking about all of the things that we do with studio thinking is that we're uncovering students' thinking. Gives us evidence of students' insights as well as their misconceptions. So now that is shifting, why are we looking at, why do we want the metacognitive data? Why do we want to uncover students' thinking? It's not just to find out what's wrong so we can fix it, but it's also to find out what are they doing that will surprise us. And then he goes on to say we need to make thinking visible because it provides us with the information we need, as teachers need, to plan opportunities that will take students' learning to the next level and enable continued engagement with ideas being expressed. And what that is almost getting to, but not quite, is the concept of autonomous learning. Okay, so when we're talking about the standards, and we're talking about more autonomous learning, and we're talking about students making in all of their classrooms in some form, you can't do that if you don't have that student feedback. That student feedback is the critical piece that then you respond to in order to fill in that gap. And the picture that I have of this is that I've seen this in so many classrooms over the years, that the student is working on something and gets stuck. And they come over to the teacher and they can have a little conference about it. And the teacher says something that makes the student do this and run back to his seat because now he knows what he's going to do. Now he knows exactly what he's done. And you've seen this 100 times in your classroom. And to me, that is like the icon of using this feedback process to promote and support autonomous learning within a classroom. So let's go now to the critique method and see what we can say about the critique method from what I was just presenting. Let's take those concepts that we want to use student feedback to learn what students understand about the content that they have understudied. That's like the basic thing. They're learning something, whether it's something about art or it's something in another classroom. We want to know, what do they understand about the content under study. And understanding is the word that's used most in the literature. Understanding is used more than know. It's not just to know or to have knowledge. It's about understanding what those facts are, something about it at a higher level. We want to learn what students understand about their own learning process. That's the kind of student feedback we need. What do they understand about their own learning process? We want to discover errors students are making in their process and understanding, and to discover misconceptions students have about their learning process, because that helps us see where the gaps are and what we want to address. And we want to learn the insights that students have to their learning process and their understanding of content material. So when we're asking for student feedback, when we're wanting students to write something for us or to say something verbally, these are really the things we need to know. And then we have to have a huge bag of possible responses within our repertoire of teachers as a teacher. And I think that a group like this is essential to develop that repertoire of responses and to get better and better at eliciting the information that we need from students. So let's get back to this. I'm glad to see that this is working, and I'm about to give you something that I think will help even more. I was searching for a framework to talk about this issue. I had all of these things that I felt were important ideas, but I didn't know how to pull it together so that it could be seen, from a distance. And some of the things that I was thinking about was, what is critique? Or how does our understanding of critique morph or change with the information that I presented earlier about student feedback? And so I thought, well, if we take into account that information, then we would say that critique is a mutual process of inquiry focused on student feedback and teacher response. That the teacher might give an initial response to provoke the student feedback. But it's this ongoing relationship of the student feedback and teacher response. It's made me think that student feedback and eliciting that feedback is really one of the key purposes of the critique, not just to let the student know or give the student a response that you think might be helpful. That students and teachers are joint researchers, exchanging data through feedback, and they're doing it toward two things. Students are growing in their understanding and skill through their current art making. And teachers are growing in understanding and skill in responding to students and in ways that stimulate autonomous learning. So that was kind of how I was beginning to see it. And then I came across a book, and I confess that I haven't read the book. I just came across a detailed description of the book, and I've ordered the book. And it's a book written in 1997 by Elliot Eisner, where the whole book is about inquiry research, a research methodology, a methodology based on inquiry. And there are two roles that are developed. One of them is the connoisseur. And in this passage that I found, it said that for Eisner, a connoisseur in research is someone who has the experience and skills to understand the subtle and not so subtle aspects of a situation, aspects that would be completely hidden to an observer who is not a connoisseur. Now, talking about what you were saying earlier, just a little while ago, you talked to somebody and they seem to understand, and then 2 days later they don't. It's like you're a connoisseur. When you're there in the presence of the connoisseur and you're providing all that scaffolding, they got it. And as soon as you're gone, it's gone, because they don't have the grounding and the understanding. Or if you have the person who it's invisible to them. You can present information to somebody as a connoisseur that you think is really strong, And other people look at it and say, what? Because they're not a connoisseur. They have no idea. They are not seeing what you're seeing when they look at the same data. Okay, so let's see a little bit more about this. He also talks about the critic. And I'm thinking about the critic in curation. And this is what we're going to be looking at tomorrow. Today we're going to stay more with the connoisseur. But the task of the critic is to perform a mysterious feat well. And this is to transform the qualities of a painting, play, novel, poem, classroom, or school, or act of teaching and learning into a public form that illumines, interprets, and appraises the qualities that have been experienced. So maybe when we're thinking about our voice and our advocacy, maybe we should be thinking about it in terms of curation. Curation and exhibits that would create a public forum for these subtleties that as connoisseurs we are dealing with. So let's talk a little bit about this idea of connoisseur. What is a connoisseur? I'm going to say flat out, everybody in this room is a connoisseur of teaching. I'm also going to say that it is the connoisseurs in schools that are holding them together right. Okay, so let's talk about what a connoisseur is. What would be a connoisseur, our teacher, as opposed to just someone straight out of school? So we're really talking about two states of mind. And we're talking about two states of inquiry. And so what I tried to do in order to get a better understanding of the connoisseur role and a teacher researcher using it is, how does it compare to this other state of mind? So you've got academic research, and then we've got inquiry research. You've got quantitative research largely, and you've got qualitative research largely. You know, can we put them both up and take a look at them both side by side in order to understand what we're dealing with and what their state of mind is, and what we're dealing with and what our state of mind is? And I've got 3 slides here in 3 different ways that take a look at it.
So the academic is the professor in a university environment who's developing a certain.
This person is using experimental methods, and this person is using other forms of knowing and determining. It's using a more critical method rather than a statistical method. Okay, so that over here, the academic role, first of all, they are dealing with defined practices. In order to enter their system, they have to define everything in a very specific way and leave out everything else. Because if they don't do that, then they can't go forward within their methodology. Usually they're depending on large-scale populations. The idea is that for it to be generalizable as a finding, it cannot be coming from small numbers of people. And what they're looking for is the practice that they can define that is the most successful with the largest number of students. That's basically what they're looking for. So whenever you're talking about things individually, like in a school, it's all being seen forward as that big population out there. And where does the school stand with regard to that bigger population? Are you more successful than other students? That kind of thing. And basically what they're trying to do is create a system of practice that is filled with these defined practices. And what you're getting more and more and more from your administration is that. You're getting that system of practices and those specific things they're looking for, and they're basing that on the fact that those have been the ones that have been found to be the most successful with the largest number of students. Now, on the other side, you've got a completely different mindset. First of all, you're dealing with constantly acquired practices. A connoisseur is somebody who is constantly acquiring new practices through their practice and is seeking to enrich and develop those practices on an ongoing basis. And they realize that there may be one practice that only works with a small group of people, but it's what they need. And there may be another practice that will work with, a lot of people, but it can be individualized. It's completely state of mind, different state of mind. Those practices are identified through inquiry. They, depending on the situations they face, they learn. Then they face a new situation and they learn. Then they face a new situation and they learn. And that's how they are, the inquiry hones and develops and enlarges those practices. And they're trying to strategically improve the learning environment, the organization of content, the framing of student feedback, the range of responses by teachers to student feedback. They're trying to tweak and improve all of the things that are going on for the situation. And they are creating a system of consultation and refinement. So in this part here, the teacher is somebody who delivers the system. It's a person within the system who has the role of system delivery. Over here, the connoisseur is developing the system and growing the system and making the system happen. So that's like one cut through the whole thing. Okay, let's take a look at it a different way. The academic role is about a system of delivery. It's about following the best practices that are demonstrated to structure and support student success in achieving content goals. So at the basic level, at the lowest level, it's about testing. That's basically what it's about. It's about what kind of a delivery system that you need in order to have high scores on the tests. On the connoisseur side, you've got a strategic practice where the teacher connoisseur matches responses with which they have deep experience to specific situations of content and student performance and student feedback to support autonomous learning and autonomous teaching. So this is the autonomous situation where the student is making, and through the making, he is organizing and understanding and deepening their understanding of content. That's what's happening. Whereas over here, the student is working down the checklist. It's going through that checklist. Parts of this, your more sophisticated parts of the academic side, they're not just interested in achieving content and knowledge. They're interested in understanding and its application. And so when this side tries to move to higher levels, they are looking for student understanding and application. And that understanding and application, and they start talking about autonomous learning. So when people are talking about this side, what you have to start to do is listen for this piece that you will hear coming up. Sometimes it's just a moment, sometimes it's just a flicker. Okay, so the teacher connoisseur is trying to clearly see their situation and work toward an optimal situation that is unique to the setting, and the participants. The teacher connoisseur consults with other connoisseurs to identify and acquire responses to situations and students and advocate for connoisseurship. Consults with other connoisseurs to see more deeply into student performance and student feedback as data and inquiry research. So putting together our data to do that advocacy. Much of what engages the connoisseur is not accessible to those outside the circle of connoisseurs. That's something that has to always be remembered. It's not going to be obvious. And how do you bridge that gap? How do you find those common pieces that Kitty was talking about in the Venn diagram? To develop a community of learners nourishes and develops connoisseurship. So that's what this group is about. And the purpose is to build an understanding of how the studio thinking project is structured, the role and the contributions of the art teachers, and to express its contribution to connoisseurship. And we also need to explore the connoisseurship in critique using mapping, verbal expression, graphic expression, all of the things that we can do, and all the other things that aren't mentioned here. So what we were going to do, but because we all just barely made it here, is we were going to do some mapping. We were going to try to map out the project and figure out how we wanted to work with the project. We were also going to do some graphic expression, and upstairs we've got some nice making materials put together for you to make some images of connoisseurship, so that tomorrow we could talk about curating that as an exhibit. But that's kind of what we had planned. But the whole idea of this group is turning it over to you. So maybe this is the time where we turn it over to you. Would you like to go upstairs and think graphically about this idea of connoisseurship? And then start tomorrow with trying to curate something, and then at the same time talking about our role and our advocacy and what we're going to do? That's kind of what I'm hearing. Is that, where are you? It's time for some student feedback.